So in his magisterial history of South India, subtitled From Prehistoric Times to the Fall of Vijayanagara, the historian Nilakanta Shastri used the 1565 abandonment of the eponymous capital city of the Vijayanagara Empire as a key temporal marker in the transition between pre-colonial southern India and early modernity. Indeed, the defeat of the imperial army at Talikota and the burning and looting of the city assumed outsized roles both in the politics of time and in the construction of communal, that is, religious conflict, well after the events in question. The fall, I have to keep my fingers free to do this all the time, the fall of the city of Vijayanagara and to the armies of a coalition of Deccani sultanates in 1565 has been taken to be a decisive political event, to be the end of an era, and as an example of temple destruction and communal violence on a grand scale. Areas of this city were indeed burned and looted, and many of its monumental temple complexes, gateways, and images were left in ruins. However, and despite an historical tradition emphasizing the total destruction of the city, the level and focus of destruction were strikingly variable, a variability that makes sense in terms of the contemporary politics of sovereignty. So the ongoing salience of medieval temple destruction, either real or imagined, should be evident to us, I think, post-Ayodhya. And indeed, we are interested here in rethinking the ways in which such destruction is understood. But beyond this, we also want to point to the way in which the fall of Vijayanagara has worked in a South Indian politics of time. That is, following Kathleen Davis's discussion of how constructions of both feudalism and of the medieval served as foils for assertions of legitimate secular authority in Europe, we can view periodization as a conceptual as well as a temporal project, and one that serves specific political interests. In South Asia, British colonial historiography posited a sequence of successive historical eras indexed by religion: the Buddhist, the Hindu, and the Muslim, followed by the British period. This scheme was really only very modestly altered by its later transformation into ancient, medieval, and modern, a series of sort of euphemistic chrononyms that continue to structure research in South Asia. So the European invention of its own medieval past as being feudal and as not modern occurred, as Davis notes, simultaneously and in conjunction with colonialism, doing specific work in the construction of contemporary sovereignties. Sovereignty as a mode of temporality is not, however, strictly a European exercise. Rather, we see the politics of time and the politics of place actively constituted and reconstituted, work that's done both by elite actors and by the more anonymous agents of the past whose actions we see most clearly in their impact on the landscape. So in this talk, we address not only some implications of 1565 for historiographic and communal imaginations, but also how these events operated in terms of the contemporary politics of sovereignty, of incorporation and reconstitution of elite authority. We draw on the material record of late Vijayanagara temple complexes and other archaeological evidence to examine patterns of differentially distributed political violence, discussing the role of commemorative destruction as well as post-1565 temple rededications and abandonments in the afterlife of Vijayanagara as a social space. And in particular, we examine the potential of monumental violence to act as a symbol or to index social memory through a creative and fluid process of instituting claims about the past, about heritage, authenticity, and the nature of the present. The events of 1565 took place within an already meaningful and contested landscape. We can thus think of the settings of social action as material forms of history, settings that provide a repertoire for the continued construction and reconstruction of place, landscape, and social geography. It is this continuing salience of Hampi Vijayanagara that provides the raw material for its historical reconstruction or reconstitution. So narratives of continuity and loss, torches past and sovereignties vanquished, new orders and timeless essentials build on the incompletely scorched earth of Vijayanagara. So in the historical imagination, the Vijayanagara state is closely identified with the capital city, so much so that the eventual abandonment of the elite precincts of the city is taken as an index for the demise of the polity and all that it came to stand for. Although the empire in fact continued after the abandonment of the capital city, historiographic traditions continue to see this event, the abandonment of the city, as indexing a significant transition. And this is actually interesting insofar as only a very small chunk of imperial territory was actually lost after 1565. And much closer to the ground, it's also clear from the archaeological remains that the great majority of the rural population continued to live and work in the region, and that even the extensive irrigation features and lands watered by the Tungabhadra River, lands inside and near the city, continued to be maintained and used. Despite the great importance accorded to the sacking of Vijayanagara in historical circles, there's actually almost nothing written about patterns of abandonment or destruction outside of the city. Certainly, there are no systematic discussions of damage outside either sweeping generalizations of the not a stone was left standing sort, or some observations on individual structures. So in this talk, we begin to address this lack by considering the differential patterns of damage and their implications. I hope you're good at reading while I'm talking. So conventional understandings of Vijayanagara emphasize the Hindu nature of the polity and its role in holding back the tide of Islam in the south. Indeed, the almost universal word choice, Vijayanagara as a bulwark against Muslim invasions, evokes the language of walls and fortifications, seemingly indexing the solid walls of the city itself. City and state here appear interchangeable. If the state, as imagined as essentially Hindu, is a bulwark against aggressive Islam, then its materialization creates an essentially Hindu urban space. By any measure, however, the actual city was multi-religious, multi-ethnic, and multilinguistic, containing Hindus of all persuasions, Jains, Muslims, and even Christians. Idioms of elite, non-religious architecture and modes of royal dress and comportment established claims and connections to the cosmopolitan elite of South Asia, including the Deccani Sultanates. So the landscape in which the city sits is defined by two sets of sacred associations that predate the founding of the city: the cult of Pampa and the identification of the Hampi Daroji hills with Kishkinda, the monkey kingdom of the Ramayana. Although the Pampa Tirtha was a culturally important place 500 or 600 years before the founding of the city, it was not a major locus of settlement prior to about 1300. Later, Vijayanagara settlement would center around the Pampa Tirtha in an appropriation of an existing sacred place, an important strategy of legitimation and positioning vis-a-vis the past. The Ramayana is, as Paula Richmond has pointed out, a potent and varied body of signifiers built on the scaffolding of a single narrative. Within the city, there's a parallel deployment of authoritative versions of Ramayana tradition and popular or folk versions that create a politics of particular readings and their points of emphasis. Several locations around the city came to be associated with Ramayana scenes from at least the 11th century, and by the 15th century, Rama came to figure centrally in royal patronage and ritual, followed in the 15th and 16th century by the cults of Vittala, Krishna, and Tiruvengalanatha, all of which figure prominently in the imperial politics of the Tulava dynasty, as we'll see. So both long-term connections and also innovations can be discerned in the landscape itself. As I noted, the city grew up around a pilgrimage spot on the Tungabhadra River. The earliest architectural remains in this area are on and near Hemakuta Hill, which contains several small pre- and early Vijayanagara temples, the oldest built possibly in the 9th century. The core of the great Virupaksha temple at Hampi, adjacent to Hemakuta, also dates back this far, although most of the structure here was built during the Vijayanagara period itself. This broad area is it's all kind of blurry, isn't it? This broad area is referred to by Fritz and Michel as the sacred center in recognition of the many massive temple complexes found here. Further south is the urban core, a walled area of settlement separated from the sacred center by an irrigated zone. The urban core contains both residential and also commercial zones. Within the urban core is the Royal Center, an area of more than 20 walled enclosures protecting areas of elite residence and work. Contained within the royal center are the elephant stables, audience halls, and platforms, examples of courtly secular architecture, and palaces, which could be both residential and administrative, and also some temples, including the large Ramachandra temple complex. So the first major expansion of urban population came in the early 14th century with the first establishment of the city, but the 16th century was the period of most rapid and significant growth. By mid-century, the city was a sprawling megalopolis whose suburbs had swallowed up several pre-existing villages. Within the city, an active building program created new monumental architecture, including many of the vast temple complexes of the sacred center. Further out, scores of new villages were established. The 16th century witnessed well-documented shifts in the form, scale, and elaboration of temple complexes within the city. This has been described as a change from simpler and smaller Deccani styles to larger and more elaborate Tamil styles, featuring walled complexes set off by monumental gopura, or towered gateways. In some cases, the Krishna, Tiruvingalanatha, and Pattabhirama temples, for example, these complexes were constructed in a single well-planned episode, while in others, like Virupaksha and Vittala, already important sacred centers were elaborated in a way that conformed to this template. But either through accretional reworking or planned construction, a series of large, elaborate, and heavily inscribed temple complexes came into being in a period of only about 25 years. These complexes were substantial settlements in their own right, towns in their own right, supporting large populations of retainers and specialists. Not only sites of devotional practice, these temples also constituted symbolically and economically powerful loci in the emergent political economy of agricultural production. Temple donations were particularly important for political legitimation, competition, and alliance building. The elaboration of the temple, in other words, has to be understood in the context of prestation and patronage, and as both an idiom of and arena for elite claims, status calculations, and practice. So the close connection between temple architecture and political ambition is no coincidence, then, as claims of authority were intimately connected to the dharmic role of kings and other leaders, though the mobilization of significant resources by temples also made them very attractive partners for aspiring elites. Kings, royal family members, royal officials, royal officers, and high-ranking elites are disproportionately represented in the establishment, elaboration, and maintenance of large temple complexes. Being and becoming elite was tied to these practices. In a striking pattern, temple donations within the city and its immediate environs peak early in the career of each of the two most prominent Tulava kings, falling off as their reigns wore on. Overall, the well-documented peak in 16th century inscriptions, sorry, no illustration here, was driven by the politics of temple donation. Inscriptions are both records of donation and a symbolic technology of an elite culture of status, rank, language, ritual, and title. Stone inscriptions, large, prominently placed, and enduring, are themselves commemorative claims, making sacred establishment and pious transaction a public and a permanent act. They draw on common pools of symbols and precedents that help establish legitimacy, sovereignty, and claims to power recognized across broad regions of the subcontinent. But the symbolic import of these inscriptions, and also the temples to which they refer, is, however, neither exhausted by their originary circumstances nor by the intended claims of their founders. Instead, these complexes came to have associations through their history of inhabitation, donation, and reconstitution, as their standing as symbols was appropriated, reworked, interpreted, and extended by successive generations. So temple complexes thus draw on existing sacred and political associations, while themselves constituting material repertoires for subsequent manipulations of meanings and claims to authority. The temple in general, and these complexes in particular, then are particularly symbolic, particularly potent symbolic sites, embodied claims to and about society, posterity, and history. So it's not surprising then that these great temples should be contested spaces in the politics of pre-colonial sovereignty. Indeed, the first of these 16th century temple complex to be built as a fully formed plan, was designed to house the Udayagiri Balakrishna, Richard Davis's paradigmatic case of looting and ritual incorporation as a politics of royal appropriation and symbolic subordination. Captured from a rival Hindu king, the Udayagiri image, as rehoused in the imperial capital, in this temple, celebrated the power and position of the most well-known Tuluva king, Krishnadeva. In the mid-16th century, following the reign of the expansive Krishnadeva and then his brother, Achyutadeva, Tuluva royal sovereignty was challenged when the youthful Sadashiva, that's hard to say fast, took the throne. The boy king, I always wanted to have a paper where he said boy king. The boy king was largely controlled by the regent, Ramaraya, an ambitious leader bent on establishing the legitimacy of his own lineage, the post-Talikota 4th dynasty, the Arividu. Dick Eaton argues, in fact, that by 1542, Ramaraya's usurpation had been effectively achieved, despite the continued existence of Sadashiva, the boy king. Thus, the locus of royal sovereignty in 1565 was to some extent twofold, with both the well-known and well-established power of the Tuluvas and the emergent claims of the Arividus both potential targets for outside powers. So just as temple construction embodies the logic of Rajadharma, the temple destruction can also be understood in the context of a contemporary politics of sovereignty, of corporation, and of the reimagination of elite authority. Royal temples were, in Eaton's words, politically active, and the site-specific shared sovereignty of their state deities ensured the latter's political vulnerability. Destruction of royal temples follows long-standing precedents in royal establishment and elite competition. So, following Eaton, Kumar, and others, we should expect selective destruction of these sites in the aftermath of the conquest, delegitimation, and replacement of prior sovereignties that were attendant upon the fall of Vijayanagara in 1565. And indeed, the treatment of temples at Vijayanagara is consistent with this thesis. Here we want to draw attention to that variation and to the relationship between selective violence and the political salience of specific sites. Okay, one more long quote for you. I'll take a drink while you're reading it. It's a good idea. Okay. So historical accounts of the sacking of the city tend to be rather vague, using terms such as destruction or fall, rather than precise assessment of the degree of damage. The notion of ruins is of course, itself a critical ingredient in European Romantic imaginary. And European scholars were critical in constructing the image of humpy ruins, the title of Longhurst's very influential 1914 guidebook. Part of an ongoing justification for colonial rule that construed the British as ending a brutal historical chapter, or as ending an era. So we must also here contend with perspectival histories in which both sides, you might say, stress the annihilation of the complete annihilation of the city, but for different ends. Thus, both Farishta and Zubieri, for example, brag about the total destruction of the city, aggrandizing their sultanate patrons. So they're on the other side. Later historians, using these same sources, stress what Krishnaswamy Iyengar called, quote, the sad tale of the end of Vijayanagara, the actual ending of which is marked by the beginning of the Maratha power in the south, end quote. So here investment in understanding Vijayanagara as a keeper of Hindu Dharma makes total destruction in some ways more desirable than a slow ebbing of power and influence, which is more like the history of the post-Tuluva state, a kind of total destruction that's necessary in order to pass on this torch. And it's the easy slippage between city and state that makes it possible then to see 1565 as the end, despite the continued salience of this polity for more than 100 years. Now, it might seem obvious somehow that total destruction would make the present existence of Hampi, as it's popularly known, as a World Heritage Monument rather impossible. And from an archaeological point of view, the city is in fact in remarkably good condition, why many of us like to work there. So what exactly happened in and around the city in 1565, and how did this influence subsequent occupational history? It's clear that there was significant burning in parts of the city and that some structures were deliberately damaged. But damage here is far from indiscriminate. And as we can show, patterns of damage are highly patterned, that's repetitive, with structures and locations most closely allied to royal power preferentially targeted. Within the urban core, there's actually little evidence for destruction. It may well be that residential and commercial neighborhoods were burned and looted, but this is not really evident from surface remains, and none of the stone structures here show any signs of burning. In the royal center, on the other hand, it's clear that there was widespread burning, but interestingly, this is focused in some specific areas. Superstructures of wood and flammable material, what you're seeing here are just the stone foundations. The superstructures of wood and flammable material burned and collapsed, causing cracking and exfoliation of stone basements, damage that has been systematically documented by the Vijayanagara Research Project. Most structures in the city were built with the local granite, a rock that spalls and peels like an onion when subjected to intense heat. We see very specific patterns here. For example, both the 100-column tall and the Mahanavami platform, which are arguably loci of royal power, both show clear evidence for burning and perhaps even for some systematic dismantling of elements. Within the royal center, I somehow get ahead. Okay, so then these are some of the other areas, including the noblemen's quarters, which we like very much. So within the royal center, then, we can isolate 3 zones of burning. All of these are located in areas of active elite residence and administration, that is at 1565. One is in a zone clearly associated with royal activity, as well as another one in a tightly controlled and densely built up area that may perhaps have been a treasury. The Ramachandra temple, on the other hand, the private chapel of the rulers of the first Sangama dynasty, is located right in the heart of the royal center. This temple is well known for its detailed Ramayana sculptures and very comprehensive Ramayana panels. And although there's burning all around the Ramachandra temple, the temple itself is entirely undamaged. Moving out to the sacred center, it would be somewhat misleading to suggest that only politically important temples were targeted. There is in fact widespread destruction and displacement of images, as well as some structural damage to balustrades, column elements, and temples throughout the city. But what's more remarkable really is difference. That is, difference in what was destroyed, difference in the level and means of devastation, and difference in what was ignored or left in a condition that was capable of rehabilitation. So within the class of large-scale monumental temple complexes, then, there's strong patterning both in the forms of destruction and in continuation or non-continuation of ritual practice. So historically, the most important sacred marker and conceptual origin point of the city, as I said, the Pampa Tirtha, especially in its reconfigured guise as the Virupaksha temple. It was during the Vijayanagara period that the great temple complex and pilgrimage center at Hampi developed. The first dynasty, the Sangamas, adopted Virupaksha as their tutelary deity, established royal grants in the presence of this god, and maintained a shrine to Virupaksha within the most elite precincts of the city, a separate shrine. Successive kings built upon this pilgrimage, both the pilgrimage center and the private shrine, throughout the life of the city, creating an historically marked and heavily inscribed nexus of political and sacral authority that was clearly associated with Vijayanagara rule. Yet this temple complex is the only one of its size, complexity, and importance to escape destruction and to remain in worship. Whatever damage it may have suffered in 1565, it was insufficient to displace or perhaps even to interrupt ritual practice that's still going on today. In contrast, the temple which evinces the greatest and most pattern level of destruction is the Vittala temple. Associated with the growth of Sri Vaishnava cults in the city, as well as the famous pilgrimage center at Pandharpur, the Vittala is among the largest, most elaborate, and politically central temples of the 16th century. Beginning as a relatively modest 15th century shrine, the Vittala was elaborated to monumental proportions through heavy royal and elite patronage between 1513 and 1554. By the mid-16th century, it had become the most important center of royal prestation, eclipsing the Virupaksha as the most heavily inscribed site in the city. Thus, while the Virupaksha might be expected to be central to the sovereignty of Vijayanagara, the temple to Vittala, a god more closely associated with a distant pilgrimage center, was more salient actually to the political milieu of the 16th century decade. Here, the damage is not incidental or random, but is an intensive and orchestrated system of massive destruction to the central axis of the temple complex, through the use of fire to weaken the granitic columns and ceiling elements. Here we have a good photo of that. So masses of fuel and possibly repeated episodes of burning would have been necessary to create this level of destruction. Nor is it likely incidental that the destruction is most profound within the site and along the sight lines of the god. But despite their proximity to the main shrine, subsidiary mandapas, the smaller structures all around the main shrine, are largely untouched. Of the remaining large temple complexes, only the Tiruvengalanatha, sometimes known as Ashutaraya's temple, evinces that same pattern of axial destruction. Among the latest and largest of these complexes to be built, this temple indexes another important pilgrimage center associated with a high level of Vijayanagara royal patronage. The remaining 16th century complexes show varying levels of localized breakage, but none approach the profound structural damage of the Vittala or the Tiruvengalanatha. Elsewhere in the city, politically important temples, including the Ramachandra and the Prasanna Virupaksha, lack any pattern of systematic structural damage. Another class of temples, ranging from small shrines to major complexes, were those built around images carved on granite boulders. While most rock carvings in this area are not formalized, some images with Ramayana associations, especially those related to the Kishkinda narrative, were highly elaborated. Two of these, the Kondandarama temple at Chakratirtha and the Rama temple on Malivanta Hill, are undamaged and are both presently in worship. So perhaps the most well-known example of deliberate damage to sculpted images is the monolithic Lakshmi Narasimha on the edge of the sacred center. Consecrated in 1528 under the patronage of the Tulava king Krishnadevaraya, this is the largest monolithic sculpture in the city. Recently reconstructed, this image was severely damaged by both fire and axe. The monumental Ganesha, however, which sits within sight of the Narasimha, has been completely undisturbed. So what are the constraints and opportunities that arise from the ashes then? Why have some temples remained in worship or been recovered while others have not? What are the conditions of the city's destruction that prefigure its subsequent possibilities? So in order to think about these issues, we now turn to the afterlife of Vijayanagara. Following the Battle of Talikota in 1565, much of the urban population fled, never to return. King and court shifted further south toward the center of the empire, and this northern border region was never again firmly under imperial control. Nevertheless, the city and its hinterland remained both habitable and inhabited. The Venetian traveler Federici, who spent 7 months in the city in 1567, noted an unsuccessful attempt to restore the capital by the Arividu claimant to the throne. But most of the rural settlements were never abandoned, and canals, reservoirs, and roadways continue to define the routes and rhythms of regional production and settlement. So in addition to continuities and discontinuities in settlement and land use, abandoned elite districts and thriving villages, forms and structures of worship were remade in complex ways after 1565. It's striking that all the great Vaishnavite temple complexes stand empty, absent any attempt at recovery or even really maintenance. Only the Virupaksha, the single large Shaivite complex, remained a living temple, probably more or less continuously. Both literary and inscriptional sources indicate continued elite and eventually even colonial patronage of the Virupaksha from the 1570s onward. Within the urban core, smaller temples that were now in worship fall into three broad categories: goddesses, Shaivite images, and Vaishnavite images with Ramayana associations. Even within the symbolic set of Ramayana images, it is Kishkinda, not Ramachandra, that's reconstituted. This elite temple, with its elaborate narrative panels and critical place in state ceremony, stands empty, while the Ram, Sita, Lakshman images carved in boulders and even unmodified natural features like Sugriva's cave, Sita Sarovar, and Anjanadri, the birthplace of Hanuman, remain salient today to a broad community of worshippers. The social construction of Kishkinda remains profoundly open, not under the control of any one constituency, but fluid, multi-centered, and associated with many small shrines, as well as even unmodified landscape features. Outside the city, we found that temples were also differentially abandoned, remade, or kept in use. Just like inside the city, Vaishnava shrines were differentially abandoned, a pattern of erasure connected to a more active mode of creative destruction, in which temples were rededicated, sometimes in unorthodox ways, quietly but forcefully, we might say, destroying temples to Vishnu to create Shaivite and goddess shrines, with exceptions made for local heroes, such as Hanuman. So to contemporary observers, the material negation of royal authority and power that was embodied in the invasion of the city would have been quite evident. The intensive and orchestrated pattern of axial destruction to the Vittala and Tiruvengalanatha temple complexes were political postures set in granite. And yet, despite the loss of most of its great temples, its elite precincts, and urban populace, Vijayanagara as city and empire continued into the succeeding centuries. Rural population continued to thrive, irrigation systems continued to be maintained, and worship continued in both institutional and in informal settings. Patterns of temple maintenance and rededication tend to suggest a loss of elite patronage and a reconfiguration of sacred landscapes in terms of popular associations and traditions. The empire, forgotten or never forgotten, may have moved on, but the active constitution of social space never stopped. Post-1565, the city entered into a succession of historiographic constructions, both popular and scholarly. Narratives of indiscriminate and total destruction worked their way through a whole variety of sources, including those with communal, with nationalist, and colonial valences. With both its origin and its eclipse imaginatively linked to Sultanate incursions, Vijayanagara came to stand for something outside its own experience, as a potent symbol of conflict and of identity, of essential tradition and resistance, or even more recently of artistic and cultural achievement. Continuously reinvented, city and empire live on in a variety of guises, from communal trope to exemplar of heritage at a grand, and these days with UNESCO, even global scale. So just as its materiality and symbolic power retain their effective claim on history, in the centuries after 1565, Vijayanagara hegemony continued to circulate as a powerful but potentially dangerous substance in narratives of South Indian sovereignty. At least part of this involves a concern for lineal relations. The Marathas and the Mysore state, for example, are both mentioned by Shastri as inheritors of empire, and indeed many later rulers claimed these kinds of connections. Historiographic constructions of Vijayanagara as an essentially religious polity, as a Hindu state, formed in opposition to Muslim expansion, lend themselves to a kind of essentialism. From whom did the Vijayanagara polity inherit its Hindu mantle, and to whom did this essence go? While these kinds of claims on history are certainly not novel, the Vijayanagara kings, rulers themselves, strategically appropriated lineages, styles, and even entire buildings. The conflation of Vijayanagara city and empire into a single entity, the distillation of this history to a single date, and its reduction to a communal icon created a cartoonish, yet clearly appealing and persistent story in which both the rise and the fall of Vijayanagara were linked to the threat of violent Islam. So selecting the fall of the city as a pivotal moment of transformed sovereignty also sutured southern India firmly to colonial historiography, creating a Muslim era to follow the Hindu age, and of course setting the stage for the British and for modernity. So just as communal interpretations of Vijayanagara history are not innocent, so also the historiographic use of 1565, and more broadly we might say the transformation from Muslim to medieval to middle period, are not entirely innocent themselves. This is probably a bad idea, but I pulled a couple of vitriolic, terrifying things off the internet to give you a sense of some of the rhetoric circulating online. After Christian Tirupati, it is Muslim Hampi, and so on. So to give you a sense that this is not by any means over. Okay, so while Europeans may have been interested in constructing an other to secular, modern secular authority, South Asia's medieval was devised as a Muslim period, superseding the Hindu period, and thus making both Muslims and Hindus equally outdated. Um, so here again, this temporality of sovereignty is clearly weighted towards the modern, whether the latter is seen as colonial or post-colonial. So back to the city. Here, I won't let you read anymore. Anila Ferghese reports that the 19th century Mackenzie manuscripts made passing references to further destruction of the Vitala temple complex, both by the Marathas and by Tipu Sultan, as well as looting of the Virupaksha by Tipu's armies. That these references are almost certainly apocryphal is beside the point. The continued symbolic salience of Vijayanagara hegemony, as embodied especially in the Vitala temple, played a sufficiently powerful role in the colonial imagination that it could be vulnerable more than a century after its actual destruction, and who knows, perhaps in perpetuity. So the social memory of 1565 then remains contested, an open forum for the uses of the past, its representation, and its import for the present. Thank you. Happy to take any questions. Yes.
The monasteries in Sringeri, the Advaita monasteries in Sringeri, claim that the swamis of that monastery were the founders of Vijayanagara Empire. So, but, do we have any evidence that, like, the fall of Vijayanagara, how it impacted support for such institutions?
That's a fabulous question, and somebody who knows that material better than me should probably answer it. I know that, there was, as you know, all kinds of patronage spread out across a huge area. So it's not as though the Vijayanagara polity ceased to exist, right? Once the city was abandoned by the elites, and they moved. So some of that continues. So I think it's more like a sort of slow falling off. And as you may know, that some Heros, I believe, suggested that actually it was the loss of the kind of Vijayanagara as a consumer that also seriously impacted Portuguese trading operations in a negative way. So it's a good question. I don't know exactly, especially for Srinivasagiri specifically. Does anybody want to know why I use old photos? Because those temples they've been rebuilt by the Archaeological Survey of India, right? So there's another kind of imagination at work about what these places are and how they ought to be. Tom, do you have a question?
Yeah, Kathy, this is just wonderful to see the localization of the fire, destruction, and so forth. I think that's a wonderful project. Just a very smart thing to do. I just wanted to ask about the residential area. You showed us an empty field with nothing in it but one stone structure still standing. Do we suppose those houses were of perishable materials, or of stone, or of what? And
oh, sorry, go ahead.
And were they burned down, or were they not?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We do suppose that those were very densely occupied areas. Carla has done a lot of work on the ceramics and surface artifacts from that area, and then I did some work on one other valley in that same area, in that same zone. And it's clear from the archaeological material, the ceramics, that it was definitely very densely settled and used. It's basically a carpet of pottery, and that conforms with the historic descriptions of the city as well. So there are a number of small stone structures. There was just a little temple sitting in there, but for the most part, it's the kind of, it's purely an archaeological deposit, really. There have been excavations in that area by the State Department of Archaeology and a little bit by the Archaeological Survey of India around big gateways and sort of fancy-looking things. As a lot of what we sort of discern about patterns of burning is from the stone structures themselves and the sort of peeling away of the rock. That's easier. Well, it's not easier, but it's easier to see on the surface. And then from excavated context, I went over this part really fast in the talk, from sort of peering in excavation units, right? And so if a thatched structure burns down and you get charcoal and so on. I mean, of course, pre-industrial cities where there's a lot of structures built out of flammable materials and people use fire to cook probably burn down a lot, right? So one needs to be careful. So, you know, we didn't do any of our own excavation in this area. Mostly it's peering into other people's excavation units over a period of decades, right? And it was particularly helpful in the Nolans Quarter area because Carla was working there and made more systematic observations actually than the excavators. So that was good. In the urban core, though, where it's been excavated, we don't see any kind of burn layer. None of the little structures, temples and things, gateways, have signs of burning and exfoliation. So I don't doubt that there was some. I mean, we don't know enough about the overall pattern, but it's striking that it's not obvious, really. As in some areas, it is quite obvious that everything's really just burned and cracked and a mess.
Lying because the capital had moved away from
the historical sources suggest that there was a lot of looting, and that seems, you know, completely looting after the army basically had moved away and left the populace, you know, unprotected in a sense. And some of the burning was surely, you know, incidental in conjunction with looting. But it's very clear that in the case of, say, the large temple complexes, that was no kind of, you know, random accidental looting. You know, you just see this very clear pattern of destruction along the central axis of the shrine and, you know, really nothing on the rest of the whole temple complex. So this is a kind of, you know, a ritual effacement of the power of these politically connected gods, let's say, and these politically connected temples. And it's very much in line with the kind of analysis of temple destruction that's been posited by Richard Eaton in terms of the way in which, you know, the sort of the sovereignties are erased by conquering people. So I think that it's a dual pattern that we get both of those kinds of things, probably. Well, you know, who exactly did what, right, is a matter of contestation. But and it's clear that there was destruction of images in the city, right?
Portuguese destroyed Elephanta Cave, you know, near Bomb.
Yeah.
There is a very large island and very beautiful temple, and many of the images have been destroyed in the same way as your picture suggested, you know, cutting off hands and so on. And it's very clear that the Portuguese sailors, when they landed there, they destroyed.
Right. It was the Sultanate armies who destroyed some of those structures. The Decani Sultanate. No, not Tipu Sultan. It's earlier and further north. So it was, you know, Bijapur and Gulbarga. They're not Hindus, right? But on the other hand, you also have to realize that if you think about the Krishna temple and the Udayagiri Balakrishna image, that was Krishna Deva Raya, a Hindu king who swiped an image from another Hindu polity and took it back to his own capital and, you know, created a kind of monumental structure around it. So it was an era in which, you know, people were busy making various kinds of, you know, claims to sovereignty and swiping at other people's claims to sovereignty in material ways, irregardless of their religious affiliation. So what I'm suggesting, in a way, too, is very much in line with what Dick Eaton has suggested, is that what's going on is not, it's not that there's no religious valence to it at all. I'm not suggesting that at all. But what's primarily happening has to do with political power and claims about sovereignty and authority. And you can see this particularly actually in the Decani Sultanates. There's a section, you know, that I didn't put in about a conflict between two sultanates over a particular temple. Yes, everything, and because of its association with Krishna Deva Raya, right? So two Muslims are arguing about a relationship having to do with the temple. It's really clearly not religious, but it's all a game of one-upsmanship and sort of power.
Kathy, thank you so much. This is a great talk, and it's led me to actually. I'm very familiar with Eaton's thesis, and I find it very convincing, but I've never thought about it in a particular landscape like this of a host of temples. And it leads me to ask the question about how much information, or how, let me see if I can frame this properly, given the choices made by the people who were destroying and desecrating, if they weren't just going after I mean, there were monumental temples and then there were smaller temples, from what I can tell. How did information flow about the relationship between sovereignty and temples? Kind of how widely accessible was that? How do you have what kind of sources are available to us to understand how the armies, the Deccan Sultanate troops coming in would have a clear sense of what to destroy and what not? And this kind of second part of the question is, I was wondering if you could just run us over quickly again. You had one slide up there where you talked about the Ganesha that was not desecrated. I was wondering if you could just run us through the particulars of that example again, because I found it very compelling.
So, first of all, I mean, we don't have that kind of historical documentation. You know exactly what your instructions are to go to this part of the city. In fact, a lot of several of the quotes that I threw up are a huge part of what the historical record is, actually. So there's very little of that. However, I don't think it's at all a mystery to contemporaneous political leaders, rulers, which temples, which places are most closely associated with the ruling kings. Right, this is very well known, and it's actually much paraded, right, in the inscriptional record. I added a mandapa to the front of the temple, and so on. So it's a very, very public thing, and I think it would not have been at all a mystery, which places were most closely associated, both with Tuluva and with Arrivadu, sort of authority figures, right? So I think that one thing that we didn't try to work out, because I don't know if we could have, but there is clearly, as I said before, sort of two things going on. There's definitely sort of your basic burning and looting in a time period in which armies go and they burn and loot. That's what they do. But there's also a kind of this orchestrated pattern of destruction going on, and that seems to me, and we can't get inside of people's heads except to see the pattern, but that seems very clearly to be highly deliberate, right? It's not as though there's even enough flammable material inside of a temple to do that sort of damage. So people would have had to haul in all kinds of burnable materials to get those patterns.
I mean, what I love about your talk is that it adds such a level of complexity to that thesis by showing us, the materiality of it in a given context. So it's really fantastic. It's really helpful. This is exactly.
Okay, so what you have, I mean, this will be oversimplifying, but what the heck, I'll just do it. So, the earlier dynasties, the Sangama dynasty, the first dynasty, they were Shaivite. And then through time, as many religious studies scholars, not me, have shown the Vijayanagara rulers became not only increasingly Vaishnavite, if that makes sense, but also less and less sort of tolerant and engaged with other traditions. Oh, and there are all kinds of interesting sectarian disputes within Vaishnavism that I've been reading about that we won't get into. But so what we see then, first of all, is that it's the Vaishnava shrines and structures which are associated with the kings and which are targeted, right? Okay. So on the right, you see here a Shaiva image, and on the left, a Vaishnava image. But not only just any old Vaishnava image, this is a Krishna Devaraya thing, right? And it's associated with the Tuluvas. Okay. It's the biggest, the most sort of obvious sort of thing. But even though these things are, all within, spitting distance of one another, if that's not too crude to say, you have one that's targeted and one that isn't, right? So it's not opportunity, like, they couldn't find the Ganesha, and so they went after the...
So if I could just push harder a little bit. So, I mean, partly what you're saying, because you did also say that it's not as though it was solely these temples that were desecrated. So there is a kind of incidental violence.
There's a low level of...
But the patterns are very clear about the political targeting
That's very clear, I think. So there's a sort of, messy underlying pattern of damage. But there are places that you would think, would be targets, like the Ramachandra temple, which has all these long associations. But it's perfect, right? Perfect. There's nothing wrong with it. And what we wanted to say in talking about not just the sort of big elite temple complexes, but what happens to small shrines after the abandonment of the elite precincts of the city, is that kind of reappropriation and reimagine a place, a lot of people are doing it. It's not like bad Muslims come in and break everything, right? It's that people that, locally also, sort of living in villages and small towns, say, we're, not particularly interested in these Vaishnava shrines, right? That's a kind of an official thing. It's a government thing, or it's the big people, that we're more interested in these Shaiva shrines and these goddess shrines. And what you see is interesting, like a tiny little temple. It's clearly, say, originally a Vaishnava shrine, but then, it's got a lingam in it or something like that, right? And sometimes things are set up, as I said, in unorthodox ways, so that you get something like a broken head of a Nandi set up as a lingam. Like, you're not really supposed to do that technically, but I mean, that's, it's casual, right? So this is happening in a small way also, with sort of individual local decisions and choices. And it's really striking when you go to Hampi, Vijayanagara, that there's one gigantic living temple, the Virupaksha, the only big Shaiva temple. All the big Vaishnava temples are archaeological sites, right? So one is a temple, and the rest are archaeological sites. So there are choices made not only by people who came in 1565 and burned things, but there are also choices made by people who did or didn't revive worship, in particular. And the one Rama temple I mentioned at Malivanta Hill is an interesting case in point, too, because it's built around this Ram, Sita, Lakshman little carving. It's a big fancy temple. It wasn't damaged, but it's a Vaishnava temple, but it wasn't, it became an archaeological site. So it was controlled by the Archaeological Survey of India. But recently, local people have taken over the shrine. So even though it was, it's supposed to be illegal to worship in an archaeological monument, people always did, and we actually attended several weddings there, illicit weddings. But now people don't even pretend that it's a monument, and it's occupied full time, right? So people make these kinds of choices, and the places change, and their meanings change depending on what people are doing.
Thank you. I enjoyed your talk. I have a question pertaining to craft production, which is what happens with the production of stone carving, especially.
Yeah.
Do you think that the various guilds of stone carvers and others, do they move to other parts of the empire, or are they still kind of based there but building for other patrons, or what happens to them? Because I can imagine how ceramic production and things like that persists, but with the royal patrons shifting away, what happens to stone carving groups?
The world's expert on this is sitting in the front row, so I hesitate to... What do you think, Carla? I mean, it seems likely, right, that sort of elite specialists wouldn't have patronage.
I think so, and I think, I think they were moving around, and I think they were probably moving between the sultanates and Vijayanagara even before.
Yes, that's definitely true. That's a good point.
That's one place where this knowledge was shared, was the artisans moving.
That's a great point. Yeah, and some of the architectural people who've worked on Sultanate architecture also have noted like real similarities in things like plaster medallions and things that you see both on, I mentioned several times, kind of cryptically non-religious elite architecture. So there's a mode of architectural style you see in the city, not temples, towers and things like that, of which the Lotus Mahal is the most famous example, that George Michel calls the Vijayanagara courtly style. And that's part of a kind of, it's a style that used to be known in architectural circles as Indo-Saracenic, right? So it has, sort of multiple kinds of stylistic inspirations. And so, some of the people who worked on Sultanate architecture have suggested that there's some shared, not only architectural traditions, but all craftspeople probably moving back and forth between Vijayanagara and the Sultanates, right? So it's not as though that those are totally separate worlds, not at all, right? So the kind of historiography, which is all about Hindu versus Muslim, really ignores that, as also people like Phil Wagner have shown very, very nicely in showing the way in which a kind of elite courtly culture is widely shared, across South Asia, and irrespective of Hindu or Muslim or whatever. Mm-hmm.
I just wanted.
Oh, I don't know. Okay, you first, and then go back.
I wanted to go back to the idea of sort of how the, quote, sacking of the city was carried out, and the idea of was it organized and how was it organized. And I thought it was important to point out that the sort of definitive battle was at some distance from the capital, and so it was a real intentional act to come to the city. And I was wondering, just building on that, if you think it's possible, because there was I believe the death of the regent occurred in this battle as well. You discussed a ruling competitor being regent. If it was a deliberate strategy and a deliberate choice, rather than a result of chaos, that this emerging dynasty chose to sort of accede to the invasion of the city in favor of establishing their subsequent capitals?
I don't know. I mean, so... Yeah, the Sultanates really hated Ramaraya. I mean, they really hated him, probably more than the Tuluvas as well. But there were certainly, they were literally headless, you might say, right? Because Ramaraya lost his head in that battle, and I don't know that there was a canny calculation of shifting further south more than just sort of sheer panic. But what the limited historical sources that we have suggest that the Sultanate armies camped out at Vijayanagara and were there for a number of months. So they had plenty of time, to do whatever they wanted. And obviously, I mean, it's the same reason that you would rob banks, right? Because that's where all the money is. So I mean, it's not surprising that there was sort of occupation and looting, because that was pretty much the norm, right, for the period. But it's what that kind of interpretation doesn't show you is the way in which there's a kind of, I think, we think, sort of a deliberate, planned effacement of Vijayanagara sovereignty through these royal temples. And remember that the king would often, co-rule with the god, or sometimes even rule only in the name of the god, right? So it wasn't as though it was a kind of secondary target, right, after the king, that the royal deity is the kingdom also in a very powerful sense. So, but, the historical documentation is very sparse, actually. And it's the kind of statements that I threw up on the screen about, everything was totally destroyed. And so it's not surprising that historians have said everything was completely destroyed. But all you really have to do is go there and look around. You realize that, it's a UNESCO World Heritage Monument because there's a lot standing. And it's famous among archaeologists because it's a beautifully preserved, abandoned city. Yes, in the back.
I also enjoyed the talk very much. Thank you. And I was quite interested in this relationship between historical sources and the archaeology. And one sort of pragmatic question that might be also slightly philosophical too about limits of knowledge. And that is, you just reiterated your point that the historical sources would never allow you to reconstruct this periodicity or this sort of patterned destruction. Mm-hmm. But I'm wondering, since the excavations haven't shown a lot of damage in other areas, it sounds to me like the temple damage in particular is looking at things like spalled granite, and in other words, can you date the temple destruction through radiocarbon dating or some other? So can the archaeological evidence really demonstrate definitively that those destructions all happened while the Sultan's armies were there? Or could they have happened 100 years later?
It is hard to do. And if those temples had been excavated in the way in which we would prefer them to have been excavated, then it would have been possible. Here, it is inferential. On the other hand, here I flip back to the archaeology part because I just sort of skimmed over it in the talk. And what you can see here is some of the palaces of the nobleman's quarter on the upper left. They've been kind of, put back together. They were excavated by the State Archaeology Department. As I said, Professor Sinopoli here was there during the excavations. And those have been reasonably carefully excavated. And what you see is in the ones that were in use in the mid-16th century, there are a few structures that were clearly abandoned before this time period, and they don't seem to show. I think there's 2 of them. They don't show any evidence of burnings, but the ones that were in use in the mid-16th century, those are the ones that have burned, and they're all burned at the same level, right? So that's pretty definitive that there was a massive conflagration, that's a good word, across a large area all at the same time, right? We know that it's mid-16th century. It would have been possible, it could be possible to do it more exactly, but we didn't do the excavations. So what we see then, on the sort of spalling and burning, you can't know exactly when that happened, right? I mean, in a more perfect world, if you had let me excavate it, I would have been able to do it. But so what we have, and this is partly why I use the old photos too, is presumably, before 1565, they were probably all right. And now we observed, and particularly my co-author observed a lot of these patterns over the last 30 years, but now you can't really see them anymore. So you look at a modern photograph, you wouldn't know that the Vittala Mahamandapa looked like this ever, actually, because it's been completely reconstructed by the Archaeological Survey of India. But so we looked back, and so here we know in 1885 it was already like this, right? So that's the best we can do. It was, sometime probably after 1565 and before 1885. And we know that some areas where we do have excavations were all burned sort of in a unit. We have, decent historical evidence that there was this, occupation and burning, and it seems plausible that this would have been the case. Yeah, we don't know exactly.
But there are some other options probably possible then.
Well, we can always blame Tipu Sultan or something. Maybe people like to. Why bother, though? Yeah, Stuart?
I was thinking about the illustrated manuscript that was done in Ahmednagar not very long after the Talakota, and the 2 sides, the 2 kings, the regent and the invading main king, were portrayed with absolutely precisely the same symbols surrounding them. That is, they had the umbrella over them, they had the sort of fan-shaped thing. And I was thinking about those symbols being equally important to seize. And in fact, they were demonstrated, they were in public audience halls of the winner, displayed these symbols of the loser. And it complicates the narrative of it being a Hindu-Muslim conflict, since when you look at the portrayal of these 2 kings in this Ahmednagar manuscript, you cannot decide which is which. They are portrayed with precisely the same royal symbols around them. And I think it's also important to point out that both armies were composite armies.
Yes, absolutely. Right.
And at the time, the symbols that they would have been following were not religious symbols. They were these secular symbols of kingship. Right. That was all.
That's right. Both armies were, multi-religious, clearly. So to say that it's a, Hindu armies destroying, or Muslim armies destroying a Hindu city is such a, gross oversimplification. Okay. Thank you.